Best-selling author James Rebanks has been called England's most famous farmer. His latest book, Pastoral Song, is a love story dedicated to the land his family has farmed for generations. It's also the story of how he's discovering a path to sustain that land and a way of life that millions of farmers around the world know and love. We visited him in the Lake District of England and saw this author and shepherd in action. This pocket of countryside in northwest England, just south of the Scottish border, is a wonder to behold. Dramatic lakes, majestic rolling hills, and timeless land and livestock, cared for by shepherds like James Rebanks.
Literally next week when I go to bring my sheep down from the mountain, I'll be doing the same work with the same technology, a sheepdog, as somebody has done 6 times a year, every year, for at least 1,000 years, maybe for 4,500 years.
Come on. Come on, there's one.
I mean, this is still mind-blowing to me, even though I grew up with it. My sheep are literally the same flock of sheep that the Viking had 1,000 years ago. They're the daughters of the daughters of the daughters of the daughters.
Right,
there's almost nowhere in the world where the farming is the same thing.
Right, Luke, come here.
Despite that remarkable unbroken chain, Rebanks says what's often missing from tourist views and classic depictions of this land are stories of the people who've actually worked it, the farmers and laborers. This is an area that's been written about endlessly, but you said you never saw your dad and your grandfather in those books.
A lot of that stuff was sort of upper middle class English literary culture. And it occasionally mentions shepherds. It often speaks about how beautiful the landscape is. But in terms of the sort of working class shepherding culture and who these people really were and what they thought their lives were about, I just thought the whole thing, like, where is it? And I thought, oh, it isn't there, is it? Someone like me has to write that story, put it on the shelf with those other books so that my people are in this story.
Like many farm children, Rebanks dropped out of school as a teenager to work the land. In his 20s, he went back to school at Oxford, but after graduation, he returned. 6 years ago, Rebanks released The Shepherd's Life, Modern Dispatches from an Ancient Landscape. Now he's followed that up with Pastoral Song, A Farmer's Journey, which details the dramatic changes Rebanks has made to his land and way of life.
Morning, ladies.
What is farming today?
For me, farming right now it's about, can I produce good, nutritious food to contribute to feed all of us so that you're fed and I'm fed and our children are? Can I make a living? Those two things are vitally important, of course, but they were the only two things for 50 or 60 years after the Second World War. And what we're now realizing is that there's a bunch of other things that matter. Can I look after my soil properly? Can I look after the rivers that flow through my land or off my land properly? Can I create the native habitats that we need around our land? You can no longer be the guy who says, no, my job's just to produce cheap food. Don't talk to me about soil. That doesn't work anymore. We're in big trouble if we don't connect these things back up.
Rebanks has reversed many of the adjustments made on this land over the past 2 generations, when industrial farming took over.
So my grandfather, 30, 40 years ago, thinks growing thorn on your land is sheer insanity. Like, only somebody that went to college could be that stupid.
That includes unstraightening rivers so they zig and zag more naturally, and rebuilding hedgerows, in the process providing a sanctuary for the birds and bees that had slowly been disappearing.
We have to put back the native habitats that we need in these landscapes if we want there to be lots of birds and lots of insects and lots of other biodiversity.
But those insects and those tiny birds aren't feeding people.
No, they're not feeding people, but we need them.
Why?
Because we don't have pollinators for our crops, because we don't have the biodiversity, so you start getting, where you have monocultures, you start to have really big problems.
Monocultures, only growing one crop at one time in one field, can lead to a boom in production. But the constant use of chemicals to combat the inevitable bust that follows is something Rebanks believes must end. You're down to almost no fertilizer?
We don't use any artificial fertilizers at all. Zero.
And that's changed the farm how?
That's changed the farm because I'm not buying that stuff. So agriculture's full of people pulling up to farm gates and trying to sell you things that sound like a great idea, but you have to write them a check. And it's required us to relearn how to grow grass really well using the sunshine and the rain rather than fossil fuels.
Rebanks' strong opinions have at times put him at odds with his ancestors, who he writes about lovingly, but also critically. When I read your first book, you kept talking about your grandfather.
Yep.
And I kept wondering, this guy doesn't like his dad.
That's very perceptive. So when I was 20 years old, I was my first ideas about writing a book was I was going to write an angry young man book. What actually happened was I was nearly 40 by the time I wrote the book, and that anger had gone. Like, me and my dad had got through whatever problems we had in my early 20s. When I ultimately finished that book, my dad was dying of cancer, and I loved him very much, and I respected him very much, and he'd grown up too. We were two different people 20 years later.
And then in the second book, I mean, he emerges as more of a hero.
Yeah, I think so. And then also looking back, I realise now how horrible I probably was as an 18 or 20-year-old.
No.
And I must have been a complete jackass to be the father of. So yeah, I think this is all part of growing up, isn't it? And I now thank the stars that I didn't write the Angry Young Man book about my dad, because that's not what I want.
I guess it's better to hate your father at first and then learn to love him versus...
That's right. When my father died 6 years ago, there was one of the last conversations I had with him. I looked him in the eye and I said, "Are you and me okay?" And he said, "Yeah, we're absolutely right." And there was no unfinished business.
There may be no unfinished business between him and his dad, but work is never finished on the farm. As Rebanks ponders what this place will look like once his stewardship is complete.
Do you consider yourself now a writer or a farmer?
I've always thought I was a farmer that writes, and then I think it's changing. I can see the day where I might not be the most important person on this farm. One of my daughters or one of my sons will take it on, and maybe my responsibility was to carry it that little way and then hand it on. And that's great. That's really important to me. It's a lot more important to me that my kids think I'm a good man or I looked after our land properly than that I'm some sort of hotshot author or something. To me, being quietly decent and working hard at the things you care about, those are probably the things I admire in people.
You like being a hotshot author, though.
A little bit.
He really does, right?
Who wouldn't? I gotta
It's great to see him so focused on the future. So government subsidies have long been a big part of farming, both in Europe and here. He says those need to continue, but maybe adjusted so that it's funds farms that are a little more sustainable moving forward. Also, the consumer, he says, has a responsibility to be asking more questions about where their food comes from. Anonymous meat, not necessarily a good thing.
More farmers need to take on that contagion, that enthusiasm about the original land. Thanks, Jeff. Well,